Beat me in this courtroom, son, and I'll resign today.
Your Honor, I'm not here to defeat you. I'm here to prove an innocent man lost 8 years because everyone stopped searching for the truth.
The courtroom had never been this quiet. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the back wall with cameras ready, attorneys whispered to one another, and even the court clerk seemed unusually tense. At the center of it all stood 24-year-old Elijah Brooks, a black law intern wearing a borrowed charcoal suit that fit just well enough to hide how little money he had. His hands rested calmly on a worn leather folder filled with notes he had spent months preparing, but his steady expression only made the laughter around the room seem louder. Across the courtroom, Judge Nathan Harrington leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had spent more than 3 decades on the bench without anyone daring to question his judgment. He looked at Elijah for a long moment before a faint smile spread across his face. "Son," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've been deciding cases since before you were born. If you can prove this court wrong today, if you actually win this case, I'll resign from this bench." The courtroom erupted with quiet chuckles. A few attorneys lowered their heads to hide their smiles, while others exchanged amused glances as if the hearing had already become entertainment. One reporter even stopped taking notes, convinced the intern was about to embarrass himself in front of the entire city. Elijah didn't react, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself, he simply looked down, opened his folder, and gently straightened a single page before raising his eyes to meet the judge's. "Very well, Your Honor," he replied in a calm voice that carried through the silent courtroom. "Let's begin." For the first time that morning, the laughter faded. There was something unsettling about the young man's confidence. He wasn't pretending to be fearless. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was the confidence of someone who already knew a truth no one else had discovered. What nobody inside that courtroom, not the reporters, not the attorneys, and certainly not the judge, could have imagined was that Elijah hadn't spent the last 6 months preparing to challenge a judge. He had spent those months uncovering one forgotten piece of evidence buried beneath thousands of pages of court records, evidence so powerful that if it proved to be genuine, it wouldn't just change the outcome of one case. It would force one of the most respected judges in the state to confront the biggest mistake of his entire career. And before the sun set that evening, the smile that had filled the courtroom only moments earlier would disappear from every face. No one in that courtroom knew where Elijah Brooks had come from, and if they had, they probably wouldn't have laughed so quickly. At 24 years old, Elijah wasn't the kind of young man who had life handed to him. He grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where sirens were louder than birds in the morning, and where too many kids learned to survive before they ever had the chance to dream. His mother, Angela Brooks, worked double shifts as a certified nursing assistant at a local hospital. Some weeks she barely slept, but she never missed one of Elijah's school events, even if she had to show up wearing her work uniform. His father, Marcus Brooks, had loved the law, but not because he was a lawyer. Years earlier, Marcus had been arrested for a robbery he didn't commit. The real criminal confessed nearly 5 years later, but by then the damage was already done. Marcus lost his job, his health, and the trust he once had in the justice system. He spent the rest of his life telling Elijah one sentence that never left his mind: "The law can protect people, son, but only if honest people are willing to fight for the truth." Marcus passed away when Elijah was 16, leaving behind little more than a box of old court papers, a worn-out fountain pen, and a dream that his son would one day stand where he never could. Elijah held onto those things like they were family treasures. He studied harder than anyone in his class, earned scholarships, worked weekends stocking grocery shelves, delivered food at night, and spent every spare dollar on law books instead of new clothes. By the time he reached law school, his classmates often assumed he came from money because his grades were so impressive. They had no idea he was skipping meals just to afford textbooks. When an internship opened at one of the state's most respected law firms, hundreds of students applied, but only one position was available. Elijah earned it through pure determination. Even then, he wasn't treated like he belonged. Most attorneys saw him as the kid who carried files, made coffee, and quietly took notes in the corner. They rarely asked for his opinion. Some didn't even remember his name. Intern was all they called him. Elijah never complained. Every evening after the office emptied, he stayed behind reading old case files, studying courtroom transcripts, and learning from every mistake made by lawyers who came before him. The security guards knew him better than some of the partners because they were the ones who locked the building after he finally left. He believed every page he read made him a little stronger. Every late night brought him one step closer to becoming the lawyer his father had dreamed he would be. A few people noticed his dedication, including his supervising attorney, Sarah Mitchell. She saw something different in Elijah. He wasn't trying to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He simply refused to stop learning. Whenever she gave him research to complete by the end of the week, Elijah returned the next morning with not only the answers but questions nobody else had thought to ask. Still, despite all his hard work, he remained just an intern in everyone else's eyes. Nobody imagined that the quiet young man carrying legal folders through the hallway would soon challenge decades of assumptions inside the state's highest courtroom. And certainly no one believed that before the week was over, the same intern would make one of the most powerful judges in the state question everything he thought he knew about justice. Judge Nathan Harrington wasn't just another judge. In the state of Illinois, his name carried weight the moment people heard it. For more than 30 years, he had presided over some of the biggest criminal and civil cases in the state. Newspapers often called him the Iron Judge because he was known for making tough decisions without showing emotion. Young lawyers admired him, experienced attorneys respected him, and defendants feared walking into his courtroom. His walls were covered with awards from legal organizations, universities invited him to give speeches, and law students filled auditoriums just to hear him talk about justice. To the public, Judge Harrington represented fairness and discipline. He believed the courtroom should be a place where facts mattered more than feelings, and no one could deny that he had built an impressive career. But after 30 years on the bench, success had quietly changed him. Without even realizing it, confidence had slowly become pride. He trusted his own judgment so much that he rarely believed anyone younger could teach him something new. In his mind, experience always beat fresh ideas. Whenever new attorneys tried to introduce unusual arguments, he often smiled politely before saying, "I've seen this before." Most of the time, he was right. That reputation made people afraid to challenge him. Lawyers carefully chose their words around him because they knew he didn't tolerate wasted time. Even senior attorneys thought twice before disagreeing with one of his opinions. The courtroom ran exactly the way he wanted, and everyone accepted that as normal. His biggest weakness wasn't corruption or dishonesty, it was certainty. He believed that after 3 decades there was very little left for him to learn. When law interns entered his courtroom, he barely noticed them. To him, they were there to observe, carry files, and learn from professionals. They weren't expected to speak unless someone asked them a direct question. More than once he had told young lawyers, books teach the law. Experience teaches judgment. It was advice he truly believed, but over time those words also revealed how little faith he had in people who were just beginning their careers. During hearings, he often recognized famous attorneys by name, greeted prosecutors with friendly conversations, and respected lawyers who had spent years in the courtroom. But interns, they blended into the background. They were simply part of the crowd. The morning Elijah Brooks walked into his courtroom, Judge Harrington looked at him the same way he had looked at hundreds of interns before him. A young man wearing a borrowed suit, carrying a legal folder, standing quietly behind a supervising attorney. Nothing about Elijah seemed different. The judge didn't know about the long nights in the law library. He didn't know about the sacrifices Elijah's mother had made or the promise Elijah had made to his late father. He saw only an inexperienced intern standing in a courtroom filled with people who had practiced law longer than Elijah had been alive. As the hearing began, the judge expected another ordinary day. He believed the case would end like so many others before it. What he didn't realize was that the quiet young man he had already dismissed had spent months uncovering facts that every experienced lawyer in the room had overlooked. For the first time in many years, Judge Nathan Harrington was about to face someone who wasn't intimidated by his reputation. Elijah wasn't interested in embarrassing the judge or proving he was smarter. He cared about only one thing, the truth. And before the day was over, the man who believed experience always won would discover that determination, careful research, and the courage to question old assumptions could change everything. The case that landed in Judge Harrington's courtroom looked ordinary at first. Most people in the legal community believed it would be over before lunch. The defendant was a 48-year-old black man named David Carter, a former city bus driver who had been serving a 15-year prison sentence for armed robbery. 8 years earlier, a neighborhood grocery store had been robbed late at night. The store owner identified David as the man holding the gun, and a jury found him guilty. Every appeal that followed failed. Different judges reviewed the case. Different lawyers took a look at the evidence. Every one of them reached the same conclusion. The the conviction stood. Over time, people stopped talking about David Carter. To the court, he was just another closed file collecting dust in the archives. Even the attorneys assigned to the new review believed there was nothing left to argue. "We've gone through this case a dozen times," one senior lawyer said during a meeting. "There's nothing new here." Everyone nodded and moved on, everyone except Elijah. While organizing old files for his supervising attorney, he noticed something that didn't feel right. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a secret witness or a surprise confession. It was a simple evidence log with 2 different times written on the same surveillance video. At first, Elijah thought it was just a clerical mistake, but the more he looked, the more questions appeared. The security camera was listed as recording 1 hour later than the police report claimed. That small difference meant the timeline of the robbery no longer matched the prosecution's version of events. Curious, Elijah dug deeper. He requested old maintenance records for the grocery store's security system. Buried in a stack of forgotten documents, he found a technician's report showing that the camera's internal clock had been broken for nearly 3 weeks before the robbery. Nobody had corrected the time until days after David's arrest. Elijah felt his heart race. If the camera's clock had been wrong, then the video used during the trial might not have shown the robbery when prosecutors claimed it did. He brought the documents to one of the senior attorneys, expecting excitement. Instead, the lawyer barely glanced at them before handing the papers back. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "Courts don't reopen cases over small paperwork mistakes." Another attorney laughed and added, "You're still an intern, Elijah. Focus on making copies and leave the legal strategy to people with experience." Their words stung, but Elijah didn't argue. He quietly returned to the law library that evening and kept searching. Night after night, he compared police reports, witness statements, maintenance logs, and court transcripts. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The evidence against David Carter wasn't as solid as everyone believed. There were missing records, conflicting timelines, and questions that no one had ever answered. Elijah wasn't trying to prove anyone incompetent, he simply wanted the truth. After nearly 6 months of research, he walked into his supervising attorney Sarah Mitchell's office, carrying a thick binder filled with documents, highlighted notes, and a timeline that connected every missing piece. Sarah spent almost 2 hours reading through his work without saying a word. When she finally looked up, her expression had completely changed. She slowly closed the binder and said, "Elijah, if this is right, an innocent man has spent 8 years behind bars." It was the first time anyone in the office truly understood what Elijah had discovered. The case everyone thought was impossible wasn't impossible at all. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to look 1 page further than everyone else. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt different. Reporters stood outside the entrance hoping for a short statement from one of the attorneys. Inside, every seat in the courtroom was filled. Word had spread that David Carter's legal team was asking the court to reopen a case that had been considered closed for nearly a decade. Most people came expecting another routine hearing. Some wanted to see Judge Harrington dismiss the request in less than an hour. As Elijah walked through the courtroom carrying a thick binder filled with documents, he could feel dozens of eyes following him. He kept his head down and quietly took his place beside his supervising attorney, Sarah Mitchell. A few lawyers sitting behind them whispered to each other. One older attorney leaned toward his colleague and said, "That's the intern who thinks he found something everyone else missed." The other smiled and replied, "Law school gives these kids too much confidence." Elijah heard every word, but he didn't respond. Sarah noticed his expression and quietly whispered, "Stay focused. Let your work speak for you." He nodded without taking his eyes off the judge's bench. A few minutes later, Judge Nathan Harrington entered the courtroom and everyone stood. After reviewing the case file for a few moments, the judge looked toward Sarah. "Counselor Mitchell," he said, "I understand your office intends to present new evidence." Sarah stood and respectfully answered, "Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like my law intern, Elijah Brooks, to explain how this evidence was discovered." The courtroom instantly became quiet. Several attorneys looked at each other in disbelief. One prosecutor actually laughed under his breath. Judge Harrington slowly removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Elijah. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then a small smile appeared on his face. "Your intern?" he asked. "You mean to tell me that after 8 years, dozens of attorneys, multiple appeals, and countless hours of legal review, the person who believes he solved this case is a law student?" A few people in the gallery laughed. Elijah calmly stood up, holding his binder against his chest. Before he could say a single word, the judge leaned back in his chair and continued, "Young man, I've been sitting on this bench for over 30 years. I've heard every argument imaginable, And I've watched hundreds of young attorneys walk into this courtroom believing they discovered something revolutionary. More laughter echoed through the room. The judge folded his hands and looked straight at Elijah. So let me make this simple. If you can prove that this court got this case wrong, if you can convince me that an innocent man has spent 8 years in prison because everyone else missed what you claim to have found. He paused just long enough for the room to become completely silent. Then he smiled confidently and said, "I'll resign from this bench." The courtroom exploded with quiet laughter and shocked whispers. Even some reporters smiled as they quickly wrote down the judge's words. Everyone expected Elijah to become nervous. Everyone expected him to apologize, sit down, or let Sarah continue instead. But Elijah did something no one expected. He slowly placed his binder on the counsel table, opened it to the first page, looked directly into Judge Harrington's eyes and spoke in a calm, respectful voice. "Thank you, Your Honor, I accept that challenge. I'm not here to prove that you're a bad judge. I'm here to prove that justice deserves one more look." In that instant, the laughter stopped. The room became so quiet that the sound of Elijah turning the first page of his binder echoed through the courtroom. For the first time that morning, Judge Harrington's smile faded just a little. He still believed the young intern would fail, but deep down, something about Elijah's confidence made him realize this hearing might not be as ordinary as he first believed. The courtroom remained completely silent as Elijah opened his binder. He didn't rush to make a dramatic speech or try to prove anyone wrong with clever words. Instead, he took a slow breath, looked at Judge Harrington and said, "Your Honor, I'm not asking this court to trust my opinion. I'm asking the court to look at the facts." He reached for the first document and handed it to the court clerk. This is the original maintenance report for the grocery store's security system, dated 3 days before the robbery. The clerk passed copies to the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorneys. Judge Harrington glanced at the paper without changing his expression. "Go on," he said. Elijah nodded and continued. "The report shows the surveillance camera's internal clock was running 1 hour and 17 minutes behind. The technician recommended repairing it immediately, but the work wasn't completed until 4 days after the robbery." The prosecutor quickly stood. "Your Honor, we've already established that minor timing errors don't change the facts of the case." Judge Harrington looked at Elijah as if expecting him to stop there, but Elijah calmly turned to another page. "You're right," he replied. "A timing error alone doesn't prove innocence, that's why I kept looking." He lifted a second document. "This is the police evidence log. It states the surveillance video was collected at 11:42 p.m. However, according to the repair records, the camera's clock was still incorrect at that time. That means the timestamp shown to the jury was never verified." A few lawyers in the gallery leaned forward. The laughter from earlier had completely disappeared. Elijah walked toward the courtroom screen and displayed 2 photographs taken from the surveillance footage. "This image was shown during the original trial," he explained. "The prosecution argued it captured David Carter leaving the store immediately after the robbery." He clicked to the next slide, but after correcting the camera's clock using the technician's report, this image was actually recorded more than an hour before the robbery even happened. The room fell quiet again. Judge Harrington adjusted his glasses and looked more carefully at the documents in front of him. For the first time that morning, he wasn't looking at Elijah as an inexperienced intern. He was looking at him as someone presenting serious evidence. Elijah continued without raising his voice. "I didn't stop there." He held up another file. "I visited the retired technician who repaired the camera. He kept personal service records because his company closed years ago. His notes confirm the camera had been reporting the wrong time for nearly 3 weeks before the incident." Sarah Mitchell watched proudly as Elijah laid each document on the evidence table in perfect order, every piece connected to the next. Nothing was based on guesses, nothing relied on emotion. It was all supported by records, dates, and witnesses. Then Elijah delivered the evidence that changed everything. "Last month," he said quietly, "I located the city's archived bus GPS records." Several people looked confused. Elijah continued, "David Carter was a city bus driver. According to these GPS records, the bus he was driving was over 7 miles away when the corrected robbery time occurred. These records were never requested during the original investigation because everyone relied on the incorrect surveillance timestamp." The prosecutor immediately flipped through the documents, searching for an answer that wasn't there. Judge Harrington slowly leaned back in his chair, no longer smiling. He looked from the GPS records to the surveillance reports, then to the technician's statement. One by one, every piece fit together. What had started as a forgotten paperwork mistake had uncovered something far more serious. An entire conviction had been built around a timeline that was never accurate. The courtroom had entered that morning expecting to watch a young intern fail. Instead, they were witnessing something no one thought possible. The deeper Elijah investigated, the clearer the truth became, and for the first time in 8 years, David Carter's innocence no longer sounded like hope. It sounded like fact. Judge Harrington sat in complete silence as he carefully looked through every document Elijah had placed before the court. The confidence that had filled his face earlier that morning was gone. He read the maintenance records again, compared them with the police evidence log, then studied the bus GPS records one more time. Finally, he looked toward the prosecutor. "Counsel," he said calmly, "do you have any evidence that disputes these records?" The prosecutor slowly stood, shuffled through his files, then lowered his head. "No, Your Honor," he admitted quietly. "The documents appear to be authentic." A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. Reporters immediately picked up their pens. The attorneys who had laughed at Elijah earlier now stared at him in disbelief. Sarah Mitchell couldn't hide the pride on her face. Judge Harrington removed his glasses and looked directly at David Carter, who had remained silent throughout the hearing. After 8 years behind bars, David's eyes were filled with tears he had fought to hold back. The judge took a deep breath before speaking again. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this court has a duty that is greater than protecting its own reputation. Its duty is to protect justice." He paused for a moment, then continued. "The evidence presented today raises serious questions about the integrity of your conviction. This court finds that the original timeline relied on inaccurate evidence that was never properly verified. Therefore, I am vacating the conviction and ordering a new trial effective immediately." For a second, no one moved. Then David covered his face with both hands as tears rolled down his cheeks. His family, sitting quietly in the gallery, broke into emotional cries. Sarah placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder without saying a word. The young intern didn't celebrate. He simply closed his binder and lowered his head, knowing this moment wasn't about proving himself right. It was about giving an innocent man another chance at life. Judge Harrington slowly stood from the bench and looked at Elijah one last time. "Mr. Brooks," he said with complete sincerity, "when this hearing began, I believed experience was enough. Today you reminded this court that justice belongs to those who never stop searching for the truth." The courtroom rose to its feet, not because anyone asked them to, but because they knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The young intern everyone had underestimated hadn't won with pride or anger. He had won with patience, facts, and the courage to keep looking when everyone else had already given up. The story didn't end when the courtroom emptied. 1 week later, Judge Nathan Harrington called a special press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters expected him to defend his reputation, but instead he walked to the podium, looked into the cameras and said, "A judge's greatest responsibility is not to protect his own pride. It is to protect the truth. I gave my word in that courtroom and I intend to keep it." With those few sentences, he announced his retirement after more than 30 years on the bench. It was a decision that shocked the entire state. Before leaving the courthouse for the last time, Judge Harrington asked Elijah Brooks to meet him privately in his chambers. The room that once felt so intimidating was now completely quiet. The judge opened a drawer, took out the fountain pen he had carried throughout his career, and placed it in Elijah's hand. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become," he said. "Never lose the courage to ask one more question when everyone else has stopped looking." Elijah thanked him with tears in his eyes. Outside the courthouse, David Carter hugged his wife and children for the first time in 8 long years. There wasn't a dry eye among the people watching. Months later, David was officially cleared of every charge, and Elijah graduated from law school with honors. As he stood to take the attorney's oath, he noticed a familiar face in the front row. Judge Harrington, now retired, was the first person to stand and applaud. In that moment, Elijah realized he hadn't just won a case. He had reminded everyone in that courtroom that justice is strongest when people have the courage to admit a mistake, seek the truth, and never stop fighting for what is right.